All right, Kevin. There might be a few more people that join us here, but I think we can probably go ahead and get ourselves started here. Just so everybody knows on the call, we are monitoring the chat feature in case there is any questions that come up during Kevin's presentation. We only have about 15, 16 people on the call right now. So I think even if you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself as well if you would rather go that route. But if we were a little bit bigger, we may just stick to this chat feature. But I think with this smaller group, I think it'd be, if you have any questions for Kevin along the way, go ahead and feel free to ask them. I think Kevin has a great presentation ready for us, and we are recording this, and we'll post it as well as some information that Kevin's provided us as well. So we'll be able to use that. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin here.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for tuning in, and thanks to Clayton and Paul and the rest of the team over here in Franklin for putting this together. I'm kind of excited. It's been a fun, actually, couple of days of preparing to do this. Haven't done a presentation for a bit, so it's kind of nice to kind of get that engine revved up again. I'm excited over the next few weeks too. We've got, I think, Ben and Chris and Jake and Joe lined up. Is that right? I think, Paul. So I mean, there's some real talent in this section, and I've had so much fun. I've been here about 4 years, and I've had so much fun being a part of the Tennessee PGA. I think it's one of the coolest groups of people I've ever worked around, and I'm just honored that I get to kick it off. With that being said, we had a little bit of a preview meeting the other day, and Paul, being our tech guy, or one of our tech guys, informed me that I'm able to go in and out of screens and show different slides and pictures. And being one of the older guys doing this, I'm gonna just stay right here because my fear is that I'll slide out to another screen and you'll never find me again. So with that being said, I did a little bit of an overview, a little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about this morning, and I forwarded it on to Paul, and he's going to have that I think available for you guys on our section site. He'll let you know where all that is. And it's a fairly brief outline. I didn't go into a whole lot of detail. But when Paul asked me if I would do this, and he asked me what I wanted to talk about this morning, it's number one, I think it's very difficult to do a video chat and talk a lot about swing theory or philosophies and things of that nature. I think it's a little bit difficult to communicate that, whereas in person you can demonstrate and use models and whatnot. So I started to think a little bit about something that maybe would be of interest to our group, and I came up with the idea of what I kind of call my decision tree. And my decision tree is very simply, when I have a student walk in, and just for the record, I go through this process, whether it's a little bit more detailed, it's a little deeper, if it's a first lesson with somebody, for sure. A lot more information gathering at that point. But to a certain extent, I go through it at every single lesson. If I've worked with somebody for 4 years, I'm still going through the decision tree in my mind. And, one of the things that I came up with is I was kind of working on this, and I expressed to my wife the other day, I said, this is kind of like trying to describe to somebody all the different pieces of riding a bicycle to somebody who's never ridden a bicycle. And this is so automated for me after 41 years of doing this that you don't really even think about it. It just happens. And so the idea and the exercise of writing it down was actually a really interesting one. And again, my wife was a teacher by education, and she said one of the exercises when she was at college and getting her teaching degree is that they had to explain to the class exactly how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and assuming that the person doesn't know what peanut butter is, doesn't know what jelly is, and doesn't know what bread is, and doesn't know what a sandwich is. And it's a lot harder than you might think it is. So it was an interesting exercise. I've actually enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun this weekend working on this. So, I want to come out first and say that this isn't about teaching philosophy. This isn't about me saying what I do is right or it's wrong. I'm sure that there are going to be some similarities of what I do and what my process is to the rest of the group, and and I'm sure that there's going to be some differences of opinion, and I think that's what makes it healthy, and it actually makes it a lot of fun to me. So, how I decide what I'm going to work on with a player, and before we get into the actual what I call my decision tree, there's three words that how I define them, and as I put it in my outline, I made it very clear this is not exactly how you would see it defined in Webster's. So if my definition doesn't make sense, doesn't jive with the dictionary, you'll understand that it's just my language. But the three different words are developmental, corrective, and adaptive. And those are three really important words for me and my teaching, and how I define them is as such. Developmental is what I would call a long-term strategic process of getting a player to be at their best. This is oftentimes broken up into a series of short-term periods that all add up to the end picture. It's kind of what I call the deep end of the pool. There's a lot more information. There's a lot more detail, breaking things down into the micro in order for the macro to kind of add up and make sense. It's not necessarily something that I reserve for just good players. It's a deeper, more long-term type of a process that we want to work towards. Corrective is a little bit more of what I would call the shorter term. Some people would call it a quick fix type of a method of going about things. I think that oftentimes the term quick fix, especially in the modern teaching, where Joe and I and some of the others that have been doing this for quite a while have seen quite an evolution in how we coach. With the advent of technology, there's so much more information out there, that sometimes the quick fix, I think, gets kind of a negative connotation to it. And I don't think it's necessarily always fair. If the only thing we do is quick fix, then I don't think it's necessarily, you're not necessarily helping the masses, the highest number of people. However, if the only thing we do is developmental, you're also going to be missing a pretty good segment of the market. There's a time and a place where you need to be quick fix oriented, and a lot of times the quick fix, and I say in my outline that the corrective, developmental, and the adaptive, we're kind of straddling all three at the same time. Oftentimes, it's not necessarily exclusively in one of those types of arenas. So the quick fix is exactly what it sounds like. It's getting somebody to hit the ball better as fast as you can with the least amount of intrusion on my part as a coach. Mrs. Haverkamp is playing in the member guest tomorrow morning, and she can't get the ball in the air. Well, I'm not going to start working on wrist conditions with Mrs. Haverkamp on Friday night when she's got to play tomorrow morning and get the ball in the air. So knowing, I think, who you're dealing with and what their situation is super, super critical. Adaptive is creating allowances for individuals' limitations. Now, limitations aren't necessarily just physical injuries or golly, I mean, how many times do you ask a player if they've got any new parts in their body? And the answer now is more yes than it is no. And it's interesting when I ask people, do you have any physical things I need to know about? And they're like, nope, perfect. Everything's great, healthy, nothing going on. 20 minutes into the lesson, they go, well, I had my hip replaced about 8 months ago. I'm like, you didn't think that I wanted to know about that when I asked you if you had any physical limitations. So physical limitations also can be a lack of speed. That's when you need to be a little bit adaptive, in my mind. You've got to look at, is this player who's 80 years old, loves to play the game, very fit, active, no real injuries, but they really can't produce a whole lot of speed. I think you need to be somewhat adaptive with that player. You can't, I guess the bottom line out of this whole thing is you can't be too rigid to your model. If you only, Joe knows Hank Johnson, I know down in Alabama, and Hank's one of my great friends. And I remember I put together a teaching summit in New England going back probably about 15 years ago, and Hank was one of my speakers, and I had another speaker in there that was kind of an instructor under one of our big name instructors that was a little bit of what you'd call a method type of a teacher. And this young man gave his presentation. I thought he did a wonderful job of explaining what he teaches. And at the end of it, I looked at Hank, and we were in the back of the room. I said, "What do you think, Hank?" And his Alabama wisdom that only Hank could have, he says, "Well, Kevin," he goes, "if all you have is a hammer, pretty soon everything starts to look like a nail." And that to me is like, don't be too rigid. Don't only look at it one way. So I think the more flexible we can be, that I think that's important in helping us to help the most people. And Joe might have been in the room. I keep referring to Joe because we've known each other for a good long time, but I want to say it was like 1998 or somewhere around there at the Teaching and Coaching Summit in New Orleans. And Tom Kite was our keynote speaker. And I had the very, very great fortune to coach Tom for about a year or so when I was in Colorado. And he's one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. And he is probably the most thorough professional person in any field I've ever come across. I mean, this man does not doesn't leave one stone unflipped in order to get better. And that's why I think he could be easily, categorized as an overachiever. Tom stood up, and he comes across as a little vanilla sometimes too. And so when he made the statement, everybody in the room kind of looked at each other and went, "Whoa, did he just say that?" Tom stands up in front of probably 2,000 golf professionals in New Orleans and said, quote, "If you say you're teaching the same thing as you did 30 years ago, you're either a liar or you suck." And everybody kind of looked at each other like, wow, that was awesome. But I guess the gist of that is, let's just keep learning. Let's keep sharing information. Let's keep reading. I've spent the better part of the last 2 weeks going really, really deep in the George Gankus information. I mean, if anybody isn't a member or is a member, the depth of and volume of information that guy put on his website is mind-boggling. I have no idea when he found the time to do it, but it's a lot. And it's interesting, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, it is it's almost the point, is you're not necessarily supposed to agree with everything. All right, so on to the tree. So I think that the most important part of this process is the interview, getting to know the player that you're dealing with, understanding who it is. And I think some of the times that the interview, some of the most valuable pieces of the interview, and I learned this from Mike Malaska, who had a great point, that if you don't watch your player as they walk into the room or walk up onto the lesson tee, you're missing a lot of the clues. Because you can see whether their feet turn out or they're very neutral and straight. Do they have a limp? Do they have a little tilt to them where, gosh, you talk about adaptive with Joe and Stacy with her back and things like that. That's the definition to me of adaptive coaching. Taking somebody but you've got to know it. You've got to understand it. So watch as they walk into the room. Part of it is their demeanor. Are they excited to be there? Or do they look like they're either nervous or they don't really want to be there? They don't believe that lessons really work or coaching really works. So a lot of those clues are right there. I'll ask them a series of questions such as, how often do you play? Do you practice? And I always try to make sure that they know, I want to know the truth. I don't want them to tell me what they think I want them to hear. I don't want, I'm going to practice 3 times a week. I'm going to play twice a week. I'm in this for the long haul. When you know for a fact that there's no way that this guy who's got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old and has a startup company, there's no way they're going to do that. So you've got to kind of try to sift through some of the stuff that they're saying that they think that's what you want to hear so that you'll be invested in it. You've got to know what you're really dealing with. What is your current handicap? What is the lowest it has ever been? And how long ago was that? And if one of the interesting ones is you'll see people that say, well, the lowest I've ever been was a 10, and right now I'm a 14. And you say, well, how long ago were you a 10? Last year. It's like, ooh, that's a big drop in one period of time. What changed? Did you try something new? Did you change equipment? Did your life change and you just stopped having the opportunity to work on your game? Did you start ignoring your short game rather than working on your whole game? So a lot of that information is going to help us be more efficient. Have you taken lessons? Now, I want to be really, really careful here. I'm super sensitive, but I always want to know. Do you take lessons? Have you taken lessons? When did you most recently take a lesson? And then I want to know, what did your coach ask you to work on? And then the key word is why. And it's really fascinating, a little bit of bothersome to me, but it's really fascinating how many people know what they're supposed to work on, but they really have no idea why. They just didn't get it. Either it wasn't communicated to them, or they just kind of let that part of it go. And I think it's really important. If somebody's going to invest in your process, they need to understand why it's important, I believe. So I want to, I'm always careful not to ever be critical of another coach. I just want to know what that player is working on and if they understand why it's important. Were you fit for your golf clubs? How many of us have seen players that have swing issues that really were brought on by poorly fit clubs? I mean, if the clubs are too heavy and too stiff and too long, or not even close to the right lie angle, the player's going to be adaptive to the equipment. We see it with our juniors, and you go, golly, I mean, what did we do before U.S. Kids came along? These kids have got such good equipment that fits them, and some of the other manufacturers as well have got such good equipment that fits them, that they can develop good fundamentals as they're growing. Whereas before, when they were all playing with cut down, heavy, stiff golf clubs, they created all kinds of bad things. But you see it a lot in our adults as well, players that just have really poorly fit equipment and they start to adapt to it. And I'll get into some of the details that I see with that in a little bit. But a lot of swing issues are tied to poor equipment. What are your goals and expectations for this lesson? I always will ask two questions, especially, this time of the year where we're typically really kind of ramping up our programs, and you're seeing some of our players for the first time. Say, I'm going to ask two questions. What is your goal for this hour? What would have you walk away going, hey, I got exactly what I really wanted to get? And what would be it if we go to November 1st and kind of you're looking at the season in the rearview mirror? What would have you saying, that was a good year. I achieved my goals. I enjoyed the game. I got better, and it's interesting to hear people, and one of the things I say to them all the time is the goal of being better is not good enough. How do you define better? Well, what is that? And I'll throw it right at them. It's like, well, what's better? Well, do you want to hit it further? Do you want to hit it straighter? Do you want to hit it higher? Do you want to whatever it might be, but give me a little detail. Better just doesn't get it. And don't be afraid to get in their face a little on that one too. What do you think you need to do to get to your goal? This is an interesting one because a lot of people haven't really thought about it. A lot of people like, I just, I need to get better, or I need to be a better putter, or I need to hit it better. Well, what does hit it better mean? Is it more solid? Is it straighter? Is it longer? I mean, keep kind of just peeling the onion back as much as you can so you can get to where you really need to go. What is your miss pattern? This is one I ask every single player when they first come in. What's your miss pattern? Oh, I'm so bad I don't have one. Yeah, you do. You're just so frustrated you don't want to see it. And so if you understand your miss pattern, some of the times especially we get into corrective, and this is a little bit on the edge of what I would call the adaptive, which is, well, if you've got, and I worked for Jim McLean for a couple of years down in Miami, down at Doral. And he, Jim was a very good player, played in the Masters as an amateur, played for the University of Houston back when they were the powerhouse. And he challenged all of us as coaches. And it was the most challenging environment I've ever been in my life, was working for him. It was unbelievable. I mean, we'd have almost fist fights break out at our staff meeting every single week. And he asked the question, and for some of the younger guys in the room, you might not be able to really get it. For the rest of us, you go, oh, that's an interesting one. If Bruce Litsky walked into your lesson room and the only thing he could do is hit a 50-yard cut, would you fix him? Now, for those of you who didn't remember Bruce Litsky as a player, you'd know that Bruce Litsky, if he hit a 10-yard fade, that was effectively a snap hook for that guy. I mean, it was phenomenal. His nickname was Leaky because everything leaked to the right. And the other part about Bruce Litsky is the guy got to the point where he didn't even have to practice. He took the summer off. He coached his kids' Little League games because he didn't want to miss the family part, so he didn't even work on it. He didn't touch his golf clubs. Are you going to fix him? Because all he does is hit a slice. It's like, it's a challenging question as a coach. Is we have a little ego involved in what we do, I think, sometimes, where we're trying to, put our fingerprint on something and really help people get better. And sometimes helping a player get better is, hey, maybe you need to tee it up on the right side of the tee box and aim it down the left rough line and let it fade back into the fairway. And that player is going to play better. They're going to enjoy the game more than necessarily always trying to fix the slice. So that's where we get a little adaptive in that. So now I'm starting to understand who I'm dealing with. And by the way, if anybody's got questions at this point, just Paul, you jump in. Now I go into what I call the data collection part of my tree, which is, I'm going to have the player hit some shots for me. I typically, and by the way, the same process goes for working on short game and putting and things of that nature too. I'm using full swing and ball striking, I think, is kind of the example, but you can apply the whole thing there. But I want to start to collect information at this point. Now, I don't like to go immediately to video and TrackMan. I start gathering TrackMan data pretty much as soon as the player's warmed up, just so I have it. But I'm using TrackMan, and we don't all have TrackMan and video too. I understand that. I mean, that's the other part of it. But I want to see what's going on. I want to hear what's going on. I want to hear the contact. Are they hitting the ball first? Are they hitting it in the middle of the face? What does the ball flight look like? What does their setup look like? What is their balance and their rhythm like? What's the player's reaction to shots? What is their emotional kind of processing of golf shots? And I have a great friend up in New England, Jane Frost, who I just think so highly of. And Jane had a great way of going about this with some of her players. And she'd say, well, how would you rate that shot on a scale of 1 to 10? What would you give that shot? And if the player said 7, she would then ask another question, which is always interesting. What would make it a 9? What would make it a 9? And you're going to learn a lot about what that individual player is looking for by asking a simple question like that. And so I'm watching, and I'm also, I don't want to depend too much on my technology. It's so valuable to us, the video. I'm so fortunate at Bellmead. We've got the TrackMan, I've got a body track mat, I've got video. I can collect just gobs of information, but I don't want it to the point where it makes me lazy as a coach either. I want to keep sharpening my eye and challenging myself to identify things on my own. And then I'll typically use the video and the TrackMan to just help me confirm or change my opinion as to what I'm seeing. And, sometimes I see this and I see this, and I'll start looking at the TrackMan data. I'm going, wow, man, that's not going on at all at Impact. And it challenges me to go maybe another layer deeper to see if I can get to it. So I have video from face on and down the line. I've got my own preferences. I'm sure everybody in the room has their preferences on where they like their cameras. I won't go into that because we have our preferences for our own reason. TrackMan data, there's certain pieces of information that I'm looking for. I always like to see what the club head speed is. If I'm dealing with somebody that is hitting 7 irons and their club head speed's in the 50s, I'm probably going to be changing my approach than somebody who's got club head speed at 90 with a 7 iron. I mean, it's just not the same game. So I think it's important that we take that into consideration. Face path, attack angle, and smash factor are things that are super important to me. If everything looks great, and they have good speed, but their smash factor is low, this player is having a hard time finding the middle of the club face, or they don't have the right golf clubs in their hands. That's the other part of that one too, because sometimes they're doing a lot of stuff, and the club itself doesn't transfer the energy very well. I think this next piece is one of the things that took me quite a while to learn as a young coach. Is I feel like that other people expect us to have the answer right away. And I learned from some really good coaches that the most important part of your lesson is when you say, give me a couple of minutes. I'm going to go study a little bit. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to look at the data. I'm going to look at the video. Sometimes I'm a little confused and I've got to go a little bit deeper, but I don't want to rush the answer until I'm really certain of the direction that we're going to go. Number one, are you going to be developmental with this player? Are you going to be corrective with this player? Are you going to be adaptive? Or are you going to be a little bit of all of them? But then look at it on video, and because a lot of times the things that we see on video or the data that we see in TrackMan are not going to be consistent necessarily with our naked eye, and the ball flight and things like that. So I try to make sure I put all of it together and then make a really clear, definitive decision in terms of what I'm going to work on and how I'm going to get there with that player. I have one of my favorite books is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the first habit is begin with the end in mind. And so I've always, I don't know where it came from, but I always kind of, when I see somebody walk into my room and they start hitting shots and I kind of, know what it is that needs to get better, I immediately have a picture formed in my brain of what that player is going to look like when we're done. And then I just go try to get there. I work towards getting to that place. And, I've never even explained that to anybody other than right here. It's just something that I've always kind of done. So it's just something that helps me a lot. Don't guess. Don't guess. Don't just try stuff with people. Be careful of being part of the Swing of the Week club. We read the magazines, or we watch the Golf Channel, or we go on the George Gankus site. Next thing you know, we're working on, new ways of digging into the ground and using pelvic rotation. That's valuable information, but be careful because it's not necessarily right for everybody. So the decision tree starts to now take shape. You're going to probably spend at least some of, if not a lot of your time in all 3 modes, the developmental, corrective, and adaptive. We already got into I have a match tomorrow morning. I don't like to practice. Now, are you really going to get in and start working on wrist angles with that player? You're going to figure out how to help that player hit better shots. And then you get into how you're going to do it. What are your tools? So, we'll get into a couple little examples here, but I think one of the most valuable exercises, going back to my time at Doral, that we did down there was, we had 8 instructors there the first year we opened that academy when McLean came in there. And it was, man, there was some talent in that room. And I had been the head professional there, and I shifted over to teaching, and I'm working around people that had more experience of teaching golf in their back pocket than I had in my whole life. So it was a pretty intimidating environment for a young instructor, but it was also so stimulating. I mean, you were constantly learning and growing and getting better. And so one year, I think it was in our second year we were there, McLean challenged all of us and said, I want you to write, each of us individually, and then we did it collectively, I want you to write down every potential bad golf shot somebody could possibly hit. Then I want you to write down every potential reason that they might hit that shot. And then I want you to write down every potential fix for that reason. And this became like a manual that was about that thick. I've got it downstairs in my bookcase. And it was basically the first faults and fixes. That this is even before Ledbetter came out with his published version. But it kind of brings me back to a story that, when I was in Colorado early, I mean, I was 22, 23 years old, and I worked for a guy in Durango, Colorado for a couple of years, and he spent his winters in down in West Palm Beach. And the director of golf down there was a guy named Jim Jameson. Jim Jameson is a guy that some of us older guys would remember, almost won the Masters, almost won the PGA championship. And I mean, he hit the ball, quail high, as they say. I mean, our nickname for him was underball, that if there were cart ropes, you actually would lift the rope up so you could hit it underneath the rope. The guy, he'd hit it so low. So he had finished his playing career and became a director of golf, and he was teaching. And one day the golf shop phone rang in Colorado, and it was underball. Underball was on the phone, and he was panicked. You could hear it in his voice. And he's like, "Is Pro there? Is Pro there?" I was like, "Yeah, hold on a second." So I get Pro on the phone, and he goes, "What's up, Jim?" And he goes, "Pro, I got a guy in the lesson tee, and he's shanking, and I tried the one way I know how to fix a shank, and it didn't work. I don't know what to do." He literally ran off the lesson tee to make a phone call. So the moral of the story is, have as many arrows in the quiver as you possibly can, because you never know when one thing isn't going to work and then another thing isn't going to work, but the fourth thing might be the kicker. So I would just encourage all of us to just keep adding arrows to the quiver and go, now that's an interesting one. I never really would have thought of that. And I'm trying to learn those things all the time. But you've got a person that's correct, and I'll use shanking as an example. You've got a person that is hitting shanks. They can't stop it. We all know that's, you talk about pandemics. That thing will run through your game in a hurry. And you got to get it. You got to get them out of it, and you've got to get them out of it as fast as you can, because it gets in their mind. It gets in their kitchen, as I like to say. So what are you going to do? How are you going to? Well, the first thing I've got to do is make sure he doesn't hit another shank. So I don't necessarily even go to the cause. So my go-to is I'll put a head cover an inch outside the golf ball and say, hit the ball and don't hit the head cover. And they figure out how to not hit the head cover, and now they can't hit it in the hosel. And first off, they're like, well, what did I do? It's like, well, does it really matter what you did? You didn't hit the head cover. I can tell you what you didn't do. And they'll hit a few more of those, and all of a sudden you can feel the tension start to go out of the room, and go, all right, now let's get into why you were hitting the head cover or would have hit the head cover before. And I find with more players than not that it's balance. If the player is out over their toes, or they're sitting back in their heels at address, they're going to find, we're amazing. We've got this little gyro in there that we'll find balance during the motion. And if we started in our heels, which is a fairly common thing, and we move towards the middle of the feet, then the hosel of the golf club's moving out towards the golf ball too. And a lot of times it's just helping people understand that they're not hitting a shank because their club face is 90 degrees open to the target. It's because they're hitting it in the hosel, and they're like, well, how come I don't hit shanks with my woods? I was like, do you hit them low left with your woods? Yeah, I do that a lot. It's like, it's the same shot. There's just no hosel on the golf club. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. So a lot of times it's just getting people to understand it. Face tape. Throw some face tape on there. Dr. Scholl's foot powder, another one. Spray it on their club face. Start to get them paying attention to where the ball's being hit on the club face. And all of a sudden, I think one of the most important pieces, and this is, I think, particularly true when you're in a developmental situation with a player, is knowing when to be quiet and to step back and let that player self-organize. Let them work through it a little bit. Don't feel like you have to give them the answer, the solution, as much as you explain to them what's going on. You explain to them maybe a couple of potential things, and feel this and do this drill and do that drill. But at a certain point, you almost need to just step away and say, and it's hard sometimes as a coach, just because you're going to watch your players struggle a little bit. But that's where a lot of their growth is going to come from, is that period of self-organization where they figure it out on their own. So, one of the drills that I use a lot for, here's a common fault that you can look at it 3 different ways, which is low point control. Low point control, I think, is one of the most important skills. And I also will define the difference between skill and technique. Technique is different methods that we might use. Skill is the ability to hit the ground where you want to hit the ground. There's a lot of techniques and methods that will achieve the outcome. Don't let me ramble here, Paul. So low point control issues. One of the things is never assume that that player knows that they're supposed to hit the golf ball first. It's crazy how often I show a video. I have a kind of a slow motion of Dustin Johnson hitting an iron, and it's really just a close-up of impact. And they're like, whoa, man, he hit the ground way after the ball. I was like, yeah. They're like, I didn't know you're supposed to do that. So don't assume that they know it, because if all of a sudden you help them understand something, it makes your job just so much easier later. You know, a poor pivot is often the cause, so I'll work on people getting into better pivot. Balance points, getting them stacked up in better balance at address is really, really important. Because if they're off balance to start with, again, I see a lot of people sitting back on their heels, and I see an awful lot of people out over their toes. That player is going to find balance, and a lot of times that's going to affect low point control. So I always go to the setup first. And then I'll do things in the corrective mode of move the ball position back, move their weight a little bit more forward. That's more corrective. We'll stack and tilt in there to help them understand, better striking of the golf ball. I'll paint lines on the turf and have them hit the ground after the line to help them get a reference. The tic-tac-toe drill I do in the bunker, where I kind of draw lines and create a grid with no golf ball and get them to take practice swings until they can hit the sand where they want to hit the sand with no ball. This is a full swing exercise. It's amazing how many people just didn't even know it, first off, let alone have the physical ability to do it. And this is where that self-organization also comes in, where I might do a tic-tac-toe grid where each intersection in this grid, and I might make a grid with 16 intersections to save time. Each intersection would represent the ball. So they're supposed to take a practice swing with a divot, the goal being, if you can hit the sand right on the intersection or even slightly past the intersection, that would represent ball first contact. If they're hitting the sand before it, it's ground first contact. Then you can get into centerness of contact in terms of where the line is in the middle of the divot, where's the lowest point of the divot, the direction of the divot, different things. There's a lot of information in there. So when I do the first grid, typically I will only use the tic-tac-toe drill with somebody who is struggling with low point control. And it's horrific. The first grid is so bad. It's like, oh my gosh, man. I mean, you wonder how some of the people could even get a ball around a golf course sometimes with that. The second grid, you usually will start to see a little flashes of skill starting to kind of come out. And almost always by the time you do a third grid, they're doing it. And they're doing it really pretty consistently. And I didn't say a word. They just figured it out because they didn't even know that was what was supposed to happen. And now there's no ball. And so then you might go in and say, all right, well, what if you can do it with no ball, but you can't do it with a ball? Well, sometimes I'll get that player to look at the front of the ball instead of the back of the ball to help them just change their focus. So that's one of the things I'll do with that. Pretty common things, two different opposite sides of the same thing, open faces and closed faces. So you've got an open face player, weak grip usually, maybe a little too much extension in the wrist, club face is wide open. They're going to throw the heck out of that thing to try to square the face, and a lot of times that's going to move low point back. Or their low point is forward, but their path is so far left that they're now just going to hit wipey cuts. So that's one thing. Then you go the other side of that and say, well, you got a player with a really closed face. Well, what's the characteristic of a slow swing speed player with a closed face? Really low ball flight. So that player is going to do what? They're going to hang back to try to get that ball up in the air. Now you got low point control issues. So sometimes getting that club face, I kind of go to the fix the face first mode a lot of times. But it's interesting that you could have low point control issues with the exact opposite issue, which is club face open, club face closed kind of manifests itself in the same way for different reasons. So, you know, I'll usually go there. Now, if I've got a developmental situation, I've got a player that's a, you know, whatever handicap, and their goal is more long-term oriented, I'm going to be working on little pieces with that player. It's not quite, it's more micro, I guess, for lack of better terms, and a little bit less macro. But I might get into, you know, changing the reason that they pivot, understanding why they're pivoted isn't as good. Might be that face, going back to that again. I'll get probably more into wrist conditions and face getting, I have a preference of more of a closed face versus an open face. It's my preference. I don't profess that it's correct or incorrect. It's just what I like. I find that when you've got a player with a reasonable amount of speed, if they get the club face a little bit more towards what is traditionally considered a little closed, you know, because I think that model has changed an awful lot during my career as a coach. Is what used to be considered square, I look at it as very open now. What used to be considered closed, I would look at it and be pretty square. A lot of that is to do with equipment, ball and the club and the shafts that we're dealing with, and the fact that we just have more understanding. We know a lot more than what we did before. So I will look at that player and go, if I've got somebody who's a little more of an early releaser with decent amount of speed, and I put that player into a really closed face situation, whether that's, you know, just a stronger grip, is it a little bit in the wrist condition, or do I actually even close the club face really, really closed at address, put their grip on there and say, hit it straight? That player is going to start to pivot differently. They're going to start moving their body through the impact area quite a lot differently to keep the face more square. They won't throw and release the club because they hit themselves in the ankle half the time. So the first guy I ever saw do that is Ron Gring, who very, very talented instructor. Who, I think the world of Ron. A little more of a golfing machine guy, but I've seen him take players and put their face at 45 degrees and say, hit a straight shot for me. And it's interesting when you have somebody that's got a little bit more skill, a little more athleticism, they will figure that out. You know, somebody that has a decent amount of speed, and this is a pretty common one, excuse me, and this goes towards us understanding a lot more of the physics of the golf swing, and, you know, whether you get into the alpha, beta, and gamma torques and forces and things like that, or you just look at whether it's going inside or outside, is probably more personal preference. But if you've got a player that's steep and narrow on the downswing, they're going to tend to back out of the shot to try to get that club to line up better at impact. You know, at the last parallel on the downswing, P6, that a lot of us would use that reference, they want to get that club head lined up with the grip. And when you're pulling down hard on it and that club is really steep and narrow, you're going to have to back out with your body to put it into position and get everything lined up. Now, a lot of times the reason that they're pulling down and they're steep and they're narrow is because they didn't have a deep enough turn and get enough depth in their lead arm. So the only way to get the club to the inside is to pull it back to the inside. And now they're kind of almost counter rotating their body. So again, very different fixes of a developmental long-term versus a corrective short-term. You've got somebody that's getting ready to go play and they're drop kicking shots. How am I going to help that player go play better? Whereas somebody who's like, all right, you're a 15 handicap, you want to be a 9 handicap next year, you know, and one of the issues you've got is inconsistency in your strike. I'm going to probably go a little bit more into the long term. Adaptive. This is one that you see a lot. We referred to it earlier. Clubs are too stiff and too heavy. Can't get the ball in the air. Don't have enough speed. So that player, I'm going to put them into a lightweight, flexible club. I'm going to throw a Zexio in their hand or something like that. And it's unbelievable. I tell you that, to me, I'd love to hear the rest of the group, that lightweight, super flexible golf club is a game changer for a lot of the people we work with. I mean, these are people that just don't generate speed. They can't hit it in the air. I do a lot of my fitting, because I do a pretty decent amount of club fitting at Bellmead as well. landing angle is the number one number that I look at. Is if they can't produce a decent landing angle on TrackMan, they're not going to hold the green. They're going to start clubbing to the front of the green. 90% of the shots that an amateur hits comes up short of what they think it should. Now they're hitting this flat trajectory shot to the front of the green so that it has room to stop on the back of the green, and they're hitting it in the front bunker all day long. So I'm trying to hit, I probably have 3 players that I coach that I'm not trying to hit it higher. Everybody else, I'm trying to get it to go higher, a little higher or a lot higher. The equipment is massive in terms of your ability to do that. Makes our job so much easier or so much harder. Players that pull down on that golf club and get steep and narrow because they didn't have enough depth in the backswing, maybe they got some limitations there. So I might flare the toes out more. I might drop the right foot back a little bit more, kind of almost pre-turn the trail hip to get it out of the way to help them turn more. A lot of people were taught not to turn their hips. A lot of people were taught not to straighten their back leg, their trail leg. You know, that's going to limit their mobility. So I get them to extend and turn those hips as much as I can get them to turn the hips. Sometimes you have to pre-turn them a little bit. And just keep in mind that if you are going to do that, I think it's really important that you have to adjust your ball position along with that adjustment. So if you drop the right foot back for a right-handed golfer, you're effectively moving the ball forward in their stance. So you make a little adjustment to ball position. Otherwise, they're going to suffer with that strike right there. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on with different problems of how I would approach them, either correctively, developmentally, or adaptively, or a little bit of all of it. But the point is I think of what this conversation was this morning was, how do I decide? And a lot of it is based on, you know, who am I working with? How often are they playing? How athletic are they? What are their physical limitations? What are their goals? And then I work towards that from there. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of my decision tree. I don't know if I've gone over on time, but anybody have questions, other ideas? I want to learn here too. So if you guys have some ideas of how you do it, then that could help me be better at it. I want to know, because this is a two-way deal.
Just so everybody knows, I believe everybody on the call is muted. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Kevin. And you just hear, even if you have a comment, please feel free to share.
Come on, Hallett. I know you've got a question or a comment. What was that? What was the question on movie night? What?
I want to know, on movie night, Kevin watches the movie backwards.
Good question. Yeah, it's pretty crazy as far as what I do look at things backwards. It's pretty nuts. You know, you start with, I guess for, you know, one of the things I've evolved in as a coach, I really think of myself as a ball flight coach now, and more than I used to. I used to think of myself as, I guess, a little more technique driven. I'm much more ball flight driven. And you know, the other part is I always have the conversation of people of what their understanding of what cause and effect on a golf ball is. Because if, you know, people get frustrated when the ball doesn't go where they want it to go. And yet, you know, they're happy when it goes where it wants to go. They're unhappy when it doesn't go where they want it to go, but they're generally speaking no more informed one way or the other. They don't really understand why either way. If they understand it, you're giving them a massive problem-solving tool by themselves. Like, so I'll ask them a lot. You'll hear me a lot say, well, what do you know about that shot? You know, did you hit the ball first? Did you hit it in the middle of the face? So I call it my two buckets, the strike bucket and the delivery bucket. Strike bucket, they each have two things. It's pretty simple. Strike bucket is, did I hit the ball first? Did I hit it close to the middle of the face? Delivery bucket is, where did the ball start? There's club face. Which way did it curve? There's face path relationship. What's the pattern? Which variable do you think you need to go attack? And all of a sudden it gives them the ability to go, you know, that was actually a little simpler than I thought it was. Now I know what's important. And I always would say that the strike is the is the master skill. That's the kind of the top of the food chain in my world. Is if you can't get them to hit the ball solidly, it kind of doesn't matter how the face and path are aligning.
Kevin, a couple questions came through here. One from Eric Brown. One first saying thank you, but he also talking about the landing angle. What is the angle you ideally would be looking for in a player?
Awesome question, Eric. 45 degrees is optimal for an iron and a hybrid. 33.9 or 34 degrees for a driver. 34 degrees is going to give you maximum carry and roll, and 45 degrees is going to give you maximum carry and control with an iron. Generally speaking, if I can get a player north of 40 and south of 50, I'm happy. When I see players get up over 50, they're probably losing distance. They're hitting it probably too spinny, a little too high. If I've got players that are south of 40, they're going to really struggle to get that ball to stop. So that's what I chase all the time is 45 and 34.
And then another question from Mark Weiniger. Where do you start with a player who has absolutely no hand-eye coordination?
Small. That's a good question, Mike. I would say small. I'd get him to, assuming this player has a little bit of golfing background. They've played. We're not talking about somebody that's never touched a club. I'm going to look at their setup and things and make some swings. A lot of times I do the line drill. I'll paint a line on the tee. It's one of the skill tests that we do for our juniors. Is have them hit a bunch of shots with the ball on a painted line and see how often they hit the line or after the line. And I start getting them to develop those things with little swings. Say, well, if you can't do it with a ball, can you do it without a ball? If you can't do it without a ball, can you do it with a smaller swing? And I'll just keep peeling it back until they can do it. And then I start to build it back up again. But, hand-eye coordination, it's an interesting deal, that we're not all created equal in that regard, and I do think it's something that is an acquired skill. I don't think people are just necessarily born with just superior hand-eye coordination. I just saw Joe's the sound of impact and contact. That's changed a lot, hasn't it? I used to be. What was the? John Jacobs. John Jacobs there's a great story about John Jacobs, and Martin Hall tells this great story. Did it at the coaching summit a couple years ago, where John Jacobs would do a deal at a Golf Digest school, and they would pull somebody randomly out of the students to hit some shots, and John Jacobs would turn his back to the player and tell him exactly the shots that he was hitting. And so, one time Martin decided he was going to have a little fun with John. And he pulls out a kind of an over-the-top, hang back fat lefty. And, the guy hits a couple of these shots, and Jacobs goes, and you could see he was a little perplexed at first. And then he goes, hit another one for me. And the guy hits another shot for him, and he looks at Martin. He goes, you're a bad man. He goes, that's a left-handed player that's coming over the top and hitting fat shots. And Martin just couldn't even believe it. So it's changed so much. The sound of equipment, where the perimeter weighting, and now with I'm a PXG guy, so we've got the polymer that is kind of an infill into the cavity, and it just makes the sound oftentimes very much the same all the way across the face. What I listen to first and foremost is sequence of sound. I want to know, are they hitting the ball first and then the ground, or are they hitting the ground first and then the ball, or are they not hitting the ground at all? So I'm always looking for sequence first. And I'll try to get the player to start paying attention to that. And you've got some people that are more auditory, some people that are more visual. That visual player, I might get them to focus a little bit more on the lines and where the club is touching the ground and things like that. But, usually you can kind of still hear whether it's on the toe or not. If it's in the heel, a lot of times that's going to be that other shot that we were talking about earlier. But the sound of the ball in the middle of the face, but the sound of the ball being hit first is what I'm trying to, and that, goes back to what we talked about earlier about keeping our own individual skill sharp, not depending too much on the technology to give us our answers as much as, are you staying sharp as a coach? Is your eye sharp? Is your ear sharp? Things like that.
Anybody have any other questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask anything. We've got a couple more minutes. If you got something.
So, if anybody's going to ask, I'll just kind of go into this. One of the things I would encourage you to do, each of us, is, I don't know how many of y'all are working right now, and how many of you are in the, the kind of the extended vacation portion of our quarantine, such as myself. But go through the exercise of writing down what you believe. It's really interesting. I know, like I referred earlier to working for Jim down at Doral, and when you work for someone like I was in that instance, it was pretty much laid out what we taught, how we taught it. And when I got my first director of instruction position, it was at Castle Pines in Denver. I was stunned at how many of my own opinions that I had formed without even knowing it, but wasn't really able to teach it because I was under a system of teaching. And sometimes you don't even know what you believe in until you're sitting down and you start writing it out, and you start asking yourself the question of, what do I believe in about this? What do I not believe in about this? What did I used to believe, but I believe differently now? And how have I evolved as a coach? And whether you do that in the form of a journal or you do it in the form of an exercise like I've done, I mean, I'll tell you what, I had more fun getting ready for today than I've had in a long time. It was so cool to sit and go, man, this is like, it's like explaining to somebody how to ride a bicycle. And that would be a heck of a hard thing to do, to explain every little bit of riding a bicycle to somebody who's never ridden a bicycle, but you've been doing it for 40 years. You just get on the bicycle and ride. Push the pedal, ride. But there's a lot more to it than that. And so, one of my favorite videos is the backward bicycle. I send it to all my players. It's like, if you think changing a golf swing that you've had for a long time is easy, watch the video. And then maybe you'll be a little nicer to yourself. Maybe you'll give yourself a little more slack in how long this might take for you to get where you want to go. And if you haven't ever watched it, y'all watch it. The backward bicycle, it's like 7.5 minutes on YouTube. It is one of the most fascinating videos I've ever watched. It's funny as all get out. It really is funny, but it's the truth. And it's really about reprogramming your brain and these neural pathways. And there's a lot of science in it, but it was illustrated in such a simple to understand format. And I sent it to my players, and you can't believe how often a player will come into my teaching bay and go, I showed that to my whole team at work. These are corporate people, and they're like, I made everybody in the room sit down in a meeting and watch the backward bicycle. And I thought that was really cool. So go through the exercise of writing down what you believe, and maybe challenge yourself on a couple things. That's how we keep getting better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you all for joining us today. This will be a wrap for today, but join us again next week. We look forward to having Ben from over at, oh man, I'm blanking on it right now.
West Haven.
Haven, there you go. Ben will be joining us next week, and I'm sure he's got a great experience for us as well, and look forward to getting through this the rest of April. So thank you again for joining us, and this will all be posted on our website for everybody to be able to enjoy and see. And so be on the lookout for that, and as well as some more information from Kevin that he provided me today. So that'll all be on the website. I'll send a link out to the entire membership. It'll be included in that email. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Mr. Kyle, are you there? Mr. Kyle.
Hey, I'm here. I forgot I had to unput everything.
Oh, say hi to Mr. Kyle. Say hi. Yeah? You waving to him?
I like how we're still being recorded.
We're still being recorded, so we should probably stop. Bye-bye to Mr. Kyle. Bye-bye. See you later.
But yeah.